All right, let's see what Sabine has to say about why professors are talking about fascism in the US.
And colleagues at American universities are having a really bad time. The
Mm-hmm.
recent actions of the Trump administration have been extremely divisive. Some are
Right,
raising alarms and speak of fascism,
right.
authoritarianism, and dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
Others see it as a long overdue reckoning. It's not the sort of thing that I normally talk about in my science news, but
Well, this my 2 cents is change needs to happen. There needs to be significant, epic change in the US. Um, so people are excited by the idea that change is happening. Some people are freaking out. Some people are not. And my personal take is that the change needs to happen, but perhaps this is not the team to do the change. Um, and this is not the team to figure out what changes actually need to happen. And I don't think either the red team or the blue team is capable of making the changes that need to happen.
I think it'll have a huge influence on science. So let's have a look. In the past weeks, the Trump administration has taken further steps to end anything related to
Right.
diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and, backed by Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, to throw out employees left and right. A lot of universities
Sorry,
have
talks pretty
already
fast.
done their DEI efforts, often more so than required by Trump's orders, an action that the American Association of University Professors dubbed anticipatory obedience. That
I mean, it's kind of like, as someone that lives in the US and experiences this, Sabine, like, effectively, it's kind of ridiculous seeing all of this go down, which is why I think this is a silly team, a very incompetent team, because it's just like, why are you going after DEI? Like, the culprit is right there. Is you've outsourced everything. The economy is moving over to China, so you know what I mean. It's all like you got to stem that. So it's sort of what they're doing is penny wise, pound foolish. It's silly.
That sounds very educated, but what it really means is they're afraid. The tension has only risen since. On March 14th, the Department of Education, acting on directives from the Trump administration, launched investigations into over 50 universities
Boise.
for alleged
Wow.
racial discrimination.
Boise. I mean, Idaho. This is like like Arizona. This is weird.
Columbia University has been a primary target. On March 7th, Trump's people revoked $400 million in federal research funding from Columbia. A week later, they issued a list of requests that the university would have to fulfill to get the money back. It includes
I mean, it's mainly because Columbia is in New York City, and so that's what's going to get under Trump's skin the most.
a mask ban and manner rules to prevent disruption in teaching. Within a week, the university basically agreed to comply, though some members of the faculty sued. The mathematician and string theory critic Peter White, who works at Columbia, wrote on his blog that this episode ushers in a new era of fascist control of the university and that Trump is now governing the US by decree as a dictator, or in the words of computer scientist Scott Arison at the University of Texas, the armies of Sauron are triumphing around the globe. They aren't the only ones with these worries. Chris Manjapra, a professor of history at Northeastern University, said in an interview with Inside Higher ED that we're witnessing the rise of what seems to be a fascist coalition. Todd Wolfson from Rutgers University called the Trump administration's demands arguably the greatest incursion into academic freedom, freedom of speech and institutional autonomy that we've seen since the McCarthy era.
And just so everyone's on the same page, fascism is an ideology that's determined by the concept that industry is what feeds society, and in order to support a strong industry, you need to have a strong military. So you need a strong government that does everything in service of a strong industry, and that includes being kind of nasty to your own population and supporting industry over population. So that's sort of, the political ideologies. It took me many years of going through this, but they're not really neatly bifurcated. It's more just this ideology, that ideology, and there's some it's just. So that's what fascism essentially is saying, is that it's a government that essentially is supporting the needs of industry, the captains of industry. That's when you'll start hearing people say, where's the captains of industry? And justifying it by a need for a strong military. So, that sort of cycle. And if you don't buy into that, then that means you're not being patriotic because you think we shouldn't have a strong military, and you're not doing the work you should be doing in order to support industry and.
And David North called it an American Trumpian version of what the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, the official subordination of intellectual and cultural life to Nazi ideology. Since you're really just here for the German words, it's pronounced Gleichschaltung. Gleichschaltung. It literally means equal circuits, though it's not irrelevant to note that David North is a member of the American Socialist Equality Party that I had no idea even existed prior to today. This is the one side of the story, but a lot of Americans support these measures for one reason or another. For example, because they think that universities have overproduced PhDs, because universities have discriminated against white people and that an investigation is long overdue, or because universities have tolerated anti-Semitism. The Republican
essentially, yeah, the US created way too many PhDs. That's kind of true, but not because it created too many PhDs. It created too many PhDs considering that its economy did not grow and did not diversify as much as it should have. As a result of the offshoring and outsourcing and giving away all the IP, all of those jobs, those interesting, cool jobs, went somewhere else. I won't say where, I'll just say they went somewhere else. And that's why it feels in the US there are PhDs sitting around being like, well, this is so, it's kind of bizarre, So there are too many PhDs in the US, but if the US had not thrown away its entire economic future, there would have been not enough PhDs. So, given how it essentially strangled its own economy, there are currently too many PhDs. It generated too many PhDs. However, the solution is even more PhDs because it needs to create more of economic diversity. So there needs to be an economic solution. There needs to be jobs over here. There needs to be redistribution of wealth. And there needs to be investment in a lot more research, development, and basic sciences. There just has to be, because without that, you are like, the US is going to lose out. The West is going to lose out. It's now not even a question of being a dominant player. It's a question of staying in the game.
Tim Wahlberg summed it up by saying that Americans do not want their money sent to institutions that serve as breeding grounds for hatred and support for terrorism. I applaud.
Yeah, so all of this is just, garbage. It's red team versus blue team. So whoever got the red and blue team to fight with each other and think of each other as enemies, congratulations. The issue is, they're blaming each other while, it was a third party that's neither red nor blue came and essentially just didn't just eat America's lunch, but is now eating America for its lunch.
Or the Trump administration for listening to the American people. I think both sides have a point. Yes, some of the efforts for diversity, equity and inclusion, such as preferably hiring people of certain demographic groups, violate equal opportunity laws. And the government has every right to prevent that from happening. The same can be said about some of the protests that US campuses have tolerated that are intimidating some groups of the population, shutting down free speech, or actually calling for violence. On the other hand, and that's very typical of Americans, the new administration overdoes it in the other direction. Like, what's the point of banning masks? Can we not just let people do what they want to do? And not all DI efforts are bad. There is value in things like practical measures to prevent biases in evaluation.
But again, I like watching this. It's very clear that Sabine doesn't understand the depth of what's happening in the US. The reason why it's gone extreme right and left right now is because people feel that pain. They are feeling extreme pain in the US, and they're coming out and complaining. But not only are they unsure of why they're feeling the pain, a part of that is because they weren't even given the educational tools required to analyze and dissect why this is happening to us. And so it's easy, there's a lot of anger, and they're looking for more and more extreme reasons. And, you know, the people at the top are desperate for that ire and anger not to be focused on them. And so it's trying to get people to fight more and more against each other. It's the masks. The mask is the issue. No, it's DEI. There's too much DEI. No, it's, you know, because there's too many people, too many flat earthers, which is kind of true. But like, these are all symptoms. So what you're focusing on is the symptom, not the actual problem.
Evaluation, networking opportunities for minority groups, or just raising awareness for, I don't know, problems that students face who are blind or sit in wheelchairs or believe we live in a multiverse. Basically, I'm afraid the pendulum will swing too hard back into the other direction. A particularly sad example of how Trump's people have gone too far is cutting down staff at NOAA, which collects and gives out weather information. Officially, the Trump administration seems...
Well, like this is, I mean, this is one of the warning signs, but it's not, there's a lot of warning signs.
Seems to think the service can be privatized, but really I suspect it's because NOAA works closely together with climate scientists. You all know I agree that a lot of tax money is wasted on so-called scientific research, but I can't think of an American scientific institution that brings more bang for the buck than NOAA. Defunding them will badly backfire. Honestly, from...
Right, but again, you're talking... So it feels like you believe that your video is maybe going to influence the policymakers within this current government. What you don't understand is that the reason why they defunded NOAA had nothing to do with science. They don't care about science or you or your opinion. It's about protecting their wealth. And so this is essentially their way of lashing out at climate change. So you can get into this whole extended discussion then about, is it their own fault? Should they have invested more in next generation technologies? The US had the lead in thorium, it had the lead in fusion, it had the lead in a lot of different areas. It threw it away. It had the lead in solar. The West had the lead in solar, if you want to include Germany as well. But effectively everyone was convinced to outsource all their jobs to third world countries, or whatever the politically correct term is, which is good for those countries. But if you were to look back at the speeches and what the agreement was that by offshoring these basic jobs, that wealth that we would continue to create would be flooded and funneled into re-educating the next generation so that there'd be more interesting jobs. Which is why you entered the scenario of people thinking, why are there too many PhDs in the US when there's no diverse jobs? And that's because in addition to outsourcing the basic labor, they stabbed everyone in the back and essentially just gave away IP. So there was a lot of shortcuts, a lot of cutting corners, I think, not shortcuts, but cutting corners, and a lot of sloppy thinking. Just in the name of greed, which got the West and specifically America to this point where it cannot compete on almost anything right now.
From the European perspective, this all looks batshit crazy. But it's right that many things have been going wrong at American universities.
And if you want, yes, Europeans think it is batshit crazy because they don't understand what's going on. The situation in the US is dire. It's very, very bad. And my experience in Europe is that they continue to look at the US as leaders, the leader of the free world, and to try to follow along and mimic them in some ways, a more sophisticated form of mimicry. And what you don't understand is that the US screwed up and you're in big trouble. So in order to assist and to continue to believe that democracy is the best form of government, you really need to take a step back and think about why do you want to support the West as opposed to China? Like, why is the Western system better than the Chinese system? Right? You can't have it both ways, right? So in the Western system it's supposed to be more humane, but is it really? Like, democracy is supposed to be the cornerstone, but isn't it capitalism really that calls all the shots? Democracy would never have sold out its own people the way that capitalism sold out. And not just capitalism as a model, it's a very useful model. Even neoliberalism has its pros. But if you follow it as a fundamentalist religion, and you've read a little too much of Ayn Rand, I love Ayn Rand's books. I think they're invigorating. There's a place in society for Ayn Rand, for sure. Like, you need to go out, you need to create waves, absolutely. But if your entire belief is that the entirety of society, the entirety of the best society in the world is determined solely by Ayn Rand's books, you're going to end up in a fascist society. Like, or something very similar to that. Like a very, very harsh, a very cruel world. And then you need to address the fact that, well, isn't the reason why we support democracy is because it's less cruel? Like, isn't that democracy? Right? And that's when, American media, especially on the right, and even on the left nowadays for a while, will try to detract from democracy to this idea of, well, it's about freedom. And that's why you hear a lot of people on the right shouting about freedom, because the media on the right doesn't want to talk about democracy. They want to talk about freedom, right? The thing that differentiates us from everyone else is freedom, and freedom is worth suffering for. And that's how you get away with it, is that we don't have to be a more benign society. We can actually be more cruel than, right, in a totalitarian Ayn Rand, the Fountainhead world, or Atlas Shrugged. We don't need to care about anyone. We can treat people even worse than communist regimes, and that's all explained away by this idea of freedom, absolute freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, which is not actual freedom of speech and freedom of thought. But again, if you push the limits to just this one facet, that opens up society to this extreme. But again, the issue in the US is not that fascism is coming to town, and that's a problem. It's not that the US is in trouble because it is becoming fascist. No, you're misunderstanding. The US is in trouble, economic trouble, big economic trouble, and that is why you see, out of desperation, people going to the extremes looking for answers. And when they don't find the answers, they go a little bit more to both extremes. Are you starting to see the picture? If things were economically more stable and people were comfortable, there would be more mingling and acceptance, and okay, you said this, oh, I don't agree with you, but I see what you're saying, and but instead it's there's a great big chasm over here. So yeah, the words French Revolution come to mind. It's not fun.
In the past years, and something needed to happen. So I think that yelling fascism is somewhat extreme at this point. Let's just stick with crazy. Hello? Mr. President! Of course, you're not crazy, but the craziest. My pleasure. Yes, I do read a lot of news, and no, the chatbots still aren't any good at writing my scripts. But what does help me a lot is ground news. Ground news is...
Okay, we are into the ads. So, yeah, Sabine makes short content. This went on longer. It's very clear that Sabine doesn't really understand. She's not a political scientist. Neither am I, but I am here, and out of necessity, I needed to understand what was going on in the US, in the world, what was happening. And so I had a lot of discussions online, in person, trying to see where people were. And that's when I had this aha moment, and it broke through, and it was like, oh, you can't get a job, you have no job security, healthcare is crap, everyone is suffering. No one is happy about the homeless situation, but everyone is pointing fingers at the others, right? But no one really has solutions. And, it's a society where it's easy to point to the left and extreme right, but they're all posing. Basically, the reason why we ended up in this situation is primarily lies on the threshold, or it lies on the feet of the Democratic Party. So however crazy you may think the Republicans are and whatnot, it's the Democratic Party, the Democrats, that essentially decided let's just be more capitalistic. And so effectively there was this era in which both the blue and the red team were competing in how fast they could sell out the American people. And yeah, I mean, again, it's only been this way for the last 100 years or so. These are the traditional caps that they wear. If you go back further, you'll see that the red and blue teams often swap hats in who's doing what. But the red team, neither the red nor the blues wanted to give up that sweet capitalistic lucre and industrial nectar. And so that's essentially what happened. That's why a few people got very, very wealthy in a very short amount of time. And that's why in the US it feels like everything in industry, everything in startup in Silicon Valley is pump and dump. There's a lot of pump and dump. In fact, it's not too far to say that everything in Silicon Valley almost exclusively is pump and dump nowadays. But that's just my opinion.